Hello everybody. I am Marie from Aunt Ray's Quilt Shop. Today we're going to talk about seam allowance. We're kind of in the middle of a series on accurate piecing. And the number one thing for accurate piecing is cutting accurately. And if you missed that video, it's on the page. You can go back and watch it. Today we're going to talk about accurate seam allowance and how to adjust it, how to know if it's accurate or not, and how to adjust it. So every machine is different. So I'm going to give you, these are just some very basic guidelines for that. And you'll have to adjust a little bit according to your machine. But you can always look at your instructions if you don't know how to do some of the things that we're going to talk about doing. Really quickly, I want to remind you that September 1st starts our next sew along. You do need to purchase this book. We're going to do this quilt right here. It is a Missouri Star pattern. You do need to purchase this. It is available in the store. It's only $10 and it actually has instructions for over 20 different blocks. So, you want to grab this pretty soon because we're going to be starting here in a couple of weeks. So I want to make sure that you have time to get your things together, and that kind of fun stuff. So grab this while you can. We're going to start that September 1st. There are very basic instructions for the blocks in the book. So I'm going to walk you through each step. We're going to do it together. You'll actually get to see me cutting, piecing, that kind of thing. You do need the book because I'm not going to give you the actual measurements and things like that because it is a copyrighted pattern and I don't want to cross that line and infringe on their copyright. So you do need to have the book, but I am going to give you the basic cutting and piecing instructions, construction, putting it together, that kind of stuff. Any tips and tricks that I issues I come up on while I am making mine, I'll share those tricks and how to avoid some issues, hopefully that kind of fun stuff. So we're, again, September 1st, we're going to get that started and it'll last, I'm not sure exactly how long, but usually several weeks. So today, again, we're talking about accurate piecing and your seam allowance. This is something that I see across the board, a pretty common problem, that your seam allowance is not correct, even though you've measured, you've tried, you've, put your ruler up underneath your needle and think you're at the right spot. You've got a piece of tape. There's different ways to mark your seam allowance. I actually have a 1/4 foot on my machine, on my big machine. My smaller machine does not, my travel machine does not have one. I can get one. Even if you have a 1/4 foot, sometimes there is a certain setting it's supposed to be on for it to actually be a 1/4 foot. Sometimes that's not even accurate. I know on my machine, there's a certain button I need to push. It moves the needle over. It's supposed to be a 1/4 inch, and it may actually be a 1/4 inch, but technically you want a scant 1/4 inch, which is a couple of threads short of actually being 1/4 inch. But I'm going to show you the process for checking your seam allowance and knowing if it's correct or not. So the first thing you're going to do, guys, use scrap fabrics. I had some 10-inch squares in a bucket in my closet over there. I just pulled a couple of these out. These work perfect because you can get multiple pieces off of it. How I did this, and you can use whatever measurement you want, I cut 2.5-inch strips off of the square because, again, this is plenty. I also cut those in half. So I actually ended up with like these, in theory, are 2.5 by 5. You want to make sure that the 2.5 is accurate more than you're worried about the length of it. You want to make sure that this is accurate. You can go back to last week's video and see about my tips on accurate cutting and making sure that there are actually 2.5-inch pieces. Sorry. So what you're going to do after you've made sure that these are both 2.5 inches wide, you're just going to sew them together. Make sure your edges are lined up the way they're supposed to be. Okay? Make sure that this edge is all the way down, lined up perfectly. Then you're going to run it through the machine. So, like I said, I have a setting and a foot on mine that is supposed to be 1/4 inch. That is what I started with. I ran it through And then I pressed it. And next week we're going to talk a little bit about pressing, because you're not ironing, you're pressing. So if I measure this back here, this actual seam between the edge of the fabric and this, it could be 1/4 inch. I actually didn't, let me do that real quick, because I didn't think. So that is right at 1/4 inch. The problem is that when you press it open, you lose a couple of threads in there. So it's, when I go through and I measure this, yes, technically it is 1/4 inch, but when I measure this here, put it on top. So the way to know how big it should be is I cut 2 2.5 inch strips. So if you add those together, that's 5 inches, right? Well, you're losing 1/4 inch on each piece with that seam. So 1/2 inch. So this should be 4.5 inches. This is, I don't know if you can see this, about 1/8 of an inch shy. See, I am just a little bit shy on this line right here once I line it up. It's hard to see, it's hard to show you on here, but it is about 1/8 of an inch. Like I said before, the last couple of weeks we've gone over this. When you are piecing small blocks, when you're doing half square triangles, when you're doing things like very small blocks, 4 or 5 inch blocks that has multiple pieces going across it, when you're working with 1 and 1.5 inch pieces, that 1/8 of an inch adds up quickly. So if you know you've cut it correctly and you've stitched it out, and this, when you measure it from here to here, it's a little bit short, that means you need to move your needle to closer to the edge. So when you're looking at the machine, you want to move it to the right. Okay. If for some reason this is too big, then that means you've got too small of a seam allowance and you want to move it to the left. Just going to have to play with it on your machine. Every machine is different on how you move the needle. Some of them have a needle button. You just move it over and back. Mine in particular has a stitch width machine or button. So like if I'm doing a zigzag or a decorative stitch, it controls how wide that stitch is. So I just moved it into where I just adjusted that setting until it moved it over. I think I pushed it 4 or 5 times and then I tried it again. This is going to take some trial and error. Luckily, I was able to get it. It worked fine the second time. So I sewed it together, pressed it open, make sure that I've got it all the way over, because it's really easy to press it over further than what it should be when we've all done it. So make sure that you've got it nice and flat and then that seam is all the way open like it should be, and press it. Then you're going to measure it again. I don't care what this right here is so much. I want to measure my overall block size. So when I measure this one, it comes right up to 4.5 inches, which is what I want it to be. Okay. So that is, and keep these around. Keep a few of these. Don't get rid of them. They're great for testing stitches or checking your seam allowance again, that kind of stuff. Like I said, on my machine, I have an actual edge on my foot. So I have my foot and then there's an edge on it that keeps my fabric, helps keep my fabric. It's not perfect, helps keep my fabric from going over further than it should. A lot of machines don't have that, especially the older ones. Another option are, some people use tape. You got to be careful with tape. It works for marking your seam allowance and where your fabric should go. I prefer something that's actually going to stop it. I have these little strips and I do use it on my travel machine. They're just little silicone strips. They pull off, they stick on. You can reposition them. They restick. I've actually restuck this one back on the little paper. You get 5 in a pack, but this gives, it's thick enough that it gives you enough of a barrier where your fabric is gonna, it's really easy to run it right up against that and not go over it like you would with just a normal piece of tape. This gives you some thickness and actually gives you a wall. The other thing you can do is once you've put this down, test your seam allowance, and you can move your needle without having to move this every time. Kind of use this as, like I use the guide on my quarter foot. Just leave this in place if you can, and then adjust your needle. Another tip that I did this when I was checking all of this out, now that I know what that setting should be, because I forget, take a picture of it with your phone. Most of us have smartphones. Take a picture of it. If you need to, write it down. But it's really easy to take a picture of it, and I know exactly what my settings need to be next time to use that quarter foot and on this particular machine, and then it's going to be just fine. I know where I need to have that needle placement at. If you were using these and for some reason you've taken it off, you worked on something else, and you're ready to put it back on, test your seam allowance again using the same method I just showed you. Test your seam allowance. A lot of projects, it's not as imperative that it be exactly right. If you're sewing a whole bunch of squares together that are all the same size, doesn't matter if they're 5, 10 inch, whatever, as long as your seam allowance is consistent, you're going to be okay. But once you start doing pieced blocks, you're trying to match this pieced block to the same size as this pieced block, and they're just different, those are going to be harder to match up if your seam allowance isn't correct. So there are a lot of projects that it's not as imperative on. The pattern that I wrote, the beginner's quilt, that one, as long as you're consistent, you're typically fine. Same thing with sewing squares together. If you're doing a jelly roll race, as long as you're consistent, you're fine. But there are projects, the one that we're going to do on the sew along, it is important that your seam allowance is going to be correct, or the size of your blocks are going to be off. And that's when you start cutting points off. That's when things don't match up. It just causes a lot of other issues. So again, accurate cutting and accurate seam allowance. So next week we are going to talk about your pressing, because in quilting we don't iron, we press. If we're ironing and we're using steam, that kind of stuff, you can actually stretch your fabric and then things don't play nice. Especially when you're working on the bias with triangles, things like that, you can have a lot of problems if you're not pressing correctly. So we're going to talk about that next week. And then the week after, and then September 1st, we will start our sew along. And a lot of these are things, the tips and tricks are going to be useful when we do our sew along. So I hope that you can join us for the sew along. I am very, very much looking forward to it. In fact, I may actually get mine started today or tomorrow. And that way I can show y'all what issues I run into and hopefully help keep you from having the same issues. So once again, I am Marie at Aunt Marie's Quilt Shop. You can find me. Make sure you hit like, subscribe, share this with your friends. You can also find me on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and at auntreesquiltshop.com. And so I hope y'all have a great day, and thank you for watching. Bye.